Hello everyone, welcome back to Down Periscope, Up Periscope, Tales of Submarine Tours. My name is Tim, I'm your host. In this episode, I'm going to talk about my very first submarine. Submarines themselves are fascinating to me, but that interest has actually changed somewhat over the years as I've grown up. Now, I'm still fascinated by them to this day, but in a somewhat different manner than you might expect. So, let me explain.
Man your battle station. Dive.
Now, just to reiterate, I have no experience working on an operational submarine. And in fact, I'm much more into ships and boats for that matter. More of a surface sailor, you might say. In fact, as I've gotten older, my desire to work on submarines is somewhat diminished, believe it or not, because the idea of being trapped underwater frightens me. Now, I'm not particularly claustrophobic. I generally don't have a problem with being in enclosed spaces, although if the spaces get really tight, then I can get a little bit anxious. So here's a little background about what goes on in my twisted brain. I have a very mild case of PTSD because I'm a survivor of the Great East Japan Earthquake, also known as the Tohoku Quake, that occurred on 11 March 2011. I was living in Fukushima Prefecture at the time, and luckily I was away from the coastline, so the whole tsunami and the nuclear accident was not an issue for me. Now, the Japan Meteorological Agency, or JMA, uses a categorical scale of seismic intensity, which is known in Japan as the Shindo scale. It's based on the amount of shaking and visual damage that a quake does, with 0 being the lowest, and it is pretty much imperceptible to people. The scale then goes up to 1, 2, 3, 4, then lower 5, upper 5, lower 6, upper 6, and then 7 being the most intense. Now, the particular area of Fukushima that I lived in, we felt a lower 6, basically. This meant that it was kind of difficult to stand, a lot of unsecured furniture toppled over, books were falling off the shelves, windows and tiles just rattled like crazy, and there was some sustained damage to unreinforced buildings. Luckily, I was in an earthquake retrofitted building during that time, so I was fairly safe, but all our earthquake alarms on our cell phones went off at the same time, and when the shaking got really intense, right, we all just got out from under our cover and we hauled ass outside to open ground. So that was that. Oh, and by the way, I should also mention that OMSI has an earthquake simulator, relatively new one actually, and it goes through several different magnitudes of earthquakes, and the Tohoku quake is actually the final one that is simulated in the earthquake simulator at a magnitude 9.1. Now, I've been aboard that earthquake simulator, and I have no problem with that, because I know that it's a simulation, right? You get in, the thing kind of shakes around a bit, but here's the problem. The OMSI earthquake simulator, at least as far as it's simulating the Tohoku earthquake, is nowhere near as intense as what I felt, or what people even closer to the epicenter of that earthquake felt. The thing is, I went inside it, and I can easily remain standing inside the earthquake simulator all day with that thing rocking a magnitude 9.1. Now, I suspect that this is probably because if it were to actually simulate a true magnitude 9.1, then people would be getting injured on this thing. So it's been watered down, so to speak. It just feels like a bunch of shaking. I was in there, I'm like, oh, this is not what it felt like. It would be far more violent in real life. But anyway, as a result of that actual experience, my trauma, if you can call it that, I guess, occurs in the form of nightmares. Now, I have this reoccurring nightmare of being trapped under a pile of rubble in a collapsed building with the water like rising up around me. And of course, I wake up from that dream right before I drown. So that's my traumatic experience, or whatever you want to call it. So it's not particularly intense. It's not even enough to really like impact my daily living. So I don't know if you could really call it PTSD, but it is there. Now, to give another example, I guess, if I watch YouTube videos of people going caving, spelunking, and they're literally like squeezing and inching their way through a tight crevasse or in a tunnel that's like barely bigger than they are, yeah, that will make me anxious just looking at it, right? It's like, ugh, no. Imagine if like the rocks shifted or whatever. No, they'd be trapped in there. And there are plenty of stories of people having gotten lost in caves or trapped in caves or mines. And that's even more terrifying. And what's even scarier is that there have been stories of people who have been trapped in caves that are filling up with water. Yeah, that's my fear. It's being trapped in an area like a room or a compartment or a submarine or a cave, and it's filling up with water, or it's completely underwater. So being underwater and being unable to surface to get air, yeah, that's traumatic to think about right there. I guess for the movie buffs out there, to give another example, there's a 1996 Rob Cohen disaster film starring Sylvester Stallone called Daylight. Now, the 1990s saw a brief resurgence of disaster-themed films, and this was kind of one of them. In the movie, Stallone plays a former New York EMS chief who's trying to save the survivors who are trapped in the Holland Tunnel after an explosion inside it seals both ends. And basically, they have to find a way out of the tunnel, which is slowly filling up with water from the Hudson River above it. Yeah, that film is basically my nightmare. There's a couple of scenes in there where people have to swim through a tunnel, through like a passageway underwater to get to some another area, and yeah, I don't like that. So, but apart from that, I mean, it's just a movie, right? I know it's a film, and I actually really enjoy it, even if it's not the greatest film out there. But I enjoy films like that, disaster films, because it's about people facing and overcoming adversity and hardship and things like that. So, ironically, I actually enjoy films like that, but parts of that film just make me squirm, But apart from that, again, I'm not really claustrophobic, so I don't really have an issue with enclosed spaces. Now, the United States lost 52 submarines in World War II, and that amounts to a casualty rate of around 20%, about 1 in 5, the highest casualty rate of any U.S. service during the war. Now, this is to say nothing of the loss rate of German U-boats during the war, which is arguably the highest casualty rate of any service of any nation during World War II. It was like 75%, give or take. So about 3/4 of U-boat submariners that went out never came back. Now, submarines do not need to be involved in enemy action to sink, as there have been the losses of submarines post-World War II. For example, USS Cochino was lost in 1949. She had a battery explosion. The USS Stickleback was lost in 1958. Additionally, there were the losses of USS Thresher in 1963 and USS Scorpion in 1968. Now, both of those submarines were lost with all hands. And of course, other countries, apart from the United States, have also lost submarines post-World War II as well. As they say, though, the fear of death is often worse than death itself. So, I guess if it's any consolation, death on a submarine that sinks to crush depth would likely be instantaneous, right? You would not even know what hit you. Like they've done like computer simulations of what happened to the Titan. What was it, last June of 2023 that was going down to visit the Titanic? Yeah, I mean, that thing imploded within a matter of milliseconds. Like, they probably didn't even know what hit them. So, yeah, I guess if it's any, reassurance, well, if the submarine does sink to crush depth, you wouldn't feel anything. You wouldn't even know it. Just 1 second, you would be alive, and then the next, boom. Now, on the other hand, if a submarine were to sink in shallow water and you are trapped inside, well, that would be far more frightening. And that has happened. Look at what happened to the submarine K-141, the Kursk, in August of 2000. So you can read about it on your own. But the Soviet Navy, and of course the post-Cold War Russian Navy, let's just say that they don't have the greatest track record when it comes to safety. Now, granted that the odds of dying on a submarine in this day and age are pretty low. Like, you're pretty safe on a submarine. But honestly, I just don't really have any inclination to serve on actual submarines. So if I absolutely had to, then I'd say I'd want to serve on a submarine in a Western Navy. The German, Navy nowadays, the Royal Navy, the US Navy or whatever, they have good track records for safety nowadays. So probably even the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. You'd be pretty safe on those. If I absolutely had to, I'd pick one of those. Anyway, that's a long-winded explanation about why I'm not a submariner in the Navy. So it might beg the question, why on earth then would I bother to work on a museum ship that's a submarine? Right? What brings me to a submarine, right? Well, Blueback is not going anywhere, for one thing. It has not moved under its own power since 1990, and it cannot submerge anymore. It's attached to steel pilings, so it ain't going anywhere. I admit that it does occasionally feel a little bit confining, you might say, being stuck in a steel tube all day, but it's not really claustrophobic. I mean, there's a big hole cut in the side of the submarine with some doors in it. So even though I'm on the submarine all day, I have the convenience of being able to easily just step outside and onto solid ground to get some fresh air and stretch my legs. Now, if I were on an operational submarine, I would not have that luxury. So I can easily just say like, oh, I need some fresh air. I step out of the doors from the Blueback, go onto the dock, or maybe even up to the building, the main building of OMSI, and all right, no problem. So that's a nice luxury to have, right? I can leave whenever I want. Yeah. Let's take you back in time. Back in the 1990s, when I was a young whippersnapper, I was really into submarines. Now, I watched a lot of TV documentaries on submarines. Like one that sticks out in my mind is a Discovery Channel documentary called Submarines, Sharks of Steel. And that aired in, I think, around 1993 or thereabouts. Now, I also grew up watching a lot of submarine movies like The Hunt for Red October or Crimson Tide and so on. And later on, I gained a strong appreciation for films like Das Boot, and I've even read the book. Other submarine films that I enjoy include Run Silent, Run Deep, Down Periscope, U-571, The Enemy Below, and so on, just to name a few. And yes, I'm fully aware of the lack of historical accuracy in many of those films, so that's not lost on me. Yes, I know U-571 is not accurate to history, but it's a submarine film, okay? Anyway, back to my childhood and the topic of this episode. I have technically been aboard an operational submarine. Now, when I was around, I think 8 or 9 years old, my family and I took a trip to Hawaii. And we were on Oahu, I'm pretty sure. And there's these sightseeing submarines known as Atlantis submarines. Now, I did some research, and this is actually a Canadian-based company, and it operates these submarines in various places. There's also Atlantis submarines in the Caribbean. Obviously, they're in Hawaii, several places in Hawaii, in fact, and they operate out of Guam. So basically, you get shuttled out to the submarine on a ferry, and once you get aboard, you sit down on these row of benches looking outboard, and you look out the large windows on the submarine as it goes down and, dives beneath the water. Now, it's not very deep, and enough light will penetrate below the surface so that you can see all the corals and the fishies and the shipwrecks and things like that. According to the company's website, these submarines can dive to a maximum depth of 150 feet. Their largest submarine, the Atlantis 14, is the largest passenger submarine in the world. It can accommodate up to 64 passengers. Now, interestingly enough, finding other accurate information on these submarines is a little bit tricky because the website does not give any technical characteristics of them apart from how deep they dive. But according to the all-knowing Wikipedia, I mean, it's on the internet, it must be accurate, right? The Atlantis 12 has a length of 65 feet, a beam of 13 feet, and a draft of 8 feet. They can dive down to depths of 150 feet. For propulsion, they use thrusters, which are DC battery operated, and they give them a top speed of 2.5 knots submerged, which is about 2.9 miles per hour or 4.6 kilometers per hour for the metric inclined. It normally has a crew of 3 people with up to 64 passengers. The tours the Atlantis submarines give last around 45 minutes. I guess in reality, these Atlantis submarines are more accurately described as submersibles rather than true submarines. And you may be wondering, well, what's the difference? Well, the difference is submarines, like actual submarines, are capable of independent operations. That is, they have living facilities for the crew, like berthing areas and a galley to prepare food. Submersibles, on the other hand, generally require the support of other vessels to remain in operation. Now, the Atlantis submarines do not have any crew accommodations, and not to mention their limited endurance on their batteries and the use of support vessels. So they have no galley in there or anything like that. So they're more submersibles, I'd say, than true submarines. But hey, semantics, right? Given the fact that I was just a wee lad, I don't recall a ton about this experience, but I do remember enjoying it, right? Oh, it was real cool being on a submarine. You get to look out the big windows, and stare at the fish and all that. So yeah, that was my only experience on an actual operational submarine, right? One that actually went underwater. My other experience with a submarine involves Blueback herself. As I mentioned previously, I took a tour of Blueback when I was young. I don't recall exactly when this was. I must have been around 10 or 11 years old or something like that. It could not have been too long after OMSI had actually acquired the submarine. It must have been sometime in the mid-90s because OMSI got Blueback in 1994. So I'm guessing it was maybe in 94, probably 95 or 96. It was definitely before 1998 because that's the last time Blueback went into dry dock for maintenance. And I specifically remember the news broadcasts, the local news stories about that, right? They detached Blueback from the dock. They towed her with a tug up the river to a shipyard, and they put her in dry dock. But I definitely went on board Blueback for a tour before 1998 when that happened. In any case, I remember that I took the tour with my dad and my best friend at the time. His name is Ben. Now, my friend Ben is a really intelligent guy. Unfortunately, we've kind of lost touch over the years. We've just gone our own separate ways, but I'm pretty sure Ben is a member of Mensa. And if you don't know what that is, that's the society for people with high IQ. That is, basically, he's a genius. So Ben is really into technology and science, even as a kid. Even when he was 8 or 9 years old, Ben was essentially studying the fundamentals of mechanical and electrical engineering, right? I mean, who does that when they're 8 or 9? But Ben did. So yeah, and subsequently, he loves the movie The Hunt for Red October. And he always watched that damn movie, every time. It's oh, I want to watch The Hunt for October. He really loved it. Anyway, I don't have Ben's level of intellect. And especially when I was a kid, I did not have much of an appreciation for technology and science and things like that. And I certainly was not picking up on the technology, science, and dramatic nuance of the film The Hunt for Red October. It was, it's too highbrow and advanced for my tiny little kid brain. It would not be until I was older that I actually gained an appreciation for that movie. And nowadays, it's actually one of my favorite submarine films, right up there with Das Boot. So my friend Ben, my dad, and I took a tour of Blueback. And to be honest, I don't recall a whole lot about what the tour guide said during the tour. Mostly because I think I was a kid and I had the attention span of a goldfish, as most kids do. However, I do recall some things very distinctly. Now, once you enter the submarine, you sit down in the wardroom in officer's country. And in this room are these little cubes of HY80 steel. These were once part of the Blueback's pressure hull. And we got them because we cut a big hole in the side of the pressure hull, and we basically chopped these things up into little cubes of steel. So we use them as sort of a little tangible artifact for the kids to actually feel, here, pick up this piece of steel, and feel how heavy that is. So that's why they're there. I remember when I took the tour, these pieces of HY80 steel used to be longer and obviously heavier. So instead of being these small little cubes that we have now, I remember it was a rectangular block of steel. And as a kid, I could barely lift one of these pieces up with both hands. I felt it. I'm like, man, this thing's heavy. Man, it's heavy as hell. And nowadays, they're just small cubes. But the pieces of HY80 steel on the submarine have definitely been changed since the submarine was first at OMSI. So at least since I first took that tour. So that's one memory I have. Another thing is that the tour guide mentioned that the Blueback was in the movie The Hunt for Red October. Now, she was. But in reality, she's only in it for about 4 seconds. Yet, I recall having this memory of the tour guide saying that Blueback was the submarine that did the famous emergency blow scene in the film where you see the submarine shoot out of the water. And for a long time, I held on to that erroneous fact. Now, it may have been that I read that somewhere or misheard the tour guide or whatever. Maybe they didn't actually say that the Blueback did that stunt, but again, my tiny little kid brain didn't pay much attention to details. It was some number of years later that I actually learned the reality of that scene. That submarine that did that stunt was USS Houston, a Los Angeles class fast attack submarine. Now, fast forward nearly 30 years later, where I'm now a tour guide on Blueback, I'm very careful about any references I make to the Hunt for Red October, and I stress that it is not Blueback that performed the emergency blow stunt. And furthermore, I actually had this middle-aged guy, a former subsailor, on one of my tours who at least claims to have been on the Houston when she did that maneuver for the film. But that's a story for another episode. I'll tell about that story a little bit in another time. Another memory I have of my tour on Blueback when I was a kid was we were in the control room, the first stop after the wardroom, and my friend Ben and I were sitting down at the dive station. We're using the steering wheels and driving the boat, so to speak. And the tour guide sounded the dive alarm. It sounds like that. And then they instructed us to, push forward on the control handles. And the tour guide said, "We are now going down." They then instructed my friend Ben and I to pull back on the controls and said, "We are now going up." Now, I may have been a stupid little kid, but even my friend and I knew that the submarine was not going anywhere. We were like, "Well, they think we're dumb. The submarine wasn't going up and down. We didn't feel it move." It's like, "We are now going down." No, we're not. You would feel the down or the up angle, right? So now we may be able to chalk this up to the fact that I probably misheard the tour guide. Maybe they didn't actually say, "We are now going down." Perhaps what they really said was, "We would now be going down or up if the submarine was moving," or something like that. But I don't know. I'm pretty sure I remember them saying, "Push forward on those control handles. We are now going down. We are now diving or submerging," or something like that. I don't know. But I think I probably just misheard it. Now, one funny thing is that I don't recall much of the rest of the tour when it came to places like the torpedo room or the enlisted berthing areas or even the maneuvering room. So I remember a little bit about the torpedo room. I remember them talking about like the explosives and, at the front of the torpedoes and all that, However, one thing I do remember is being in the crew's mess, which is like the second to last stop on the submarine. And I remember the joke they said about the soft serve ice cream machine. And it basically goes like this. "This submarine had soft serve ice cream on it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Any flavor you want, as long as you want vanilla." Now, of course, my tiny kid brain did not get the joke. I had to have it explained to me. I'm like, "I don't get it." My dad's like, "It means that you can only have vanilla." I'm like, "Oh, okay. Oh, that's lame," And yes, we still use that joke even today, but only the adults really laugh at it because they're the only ones that get it. So I guess I'm not alone there, right? So those were my distinct memories of my tour of the Blueback when I was a kid. And I'll fully concede that I don't remember much of the tour because, in all likelihood, those memories are probably inaccurate to some degree, despite them appearing to be very accurate in my mind's eye. Now, I previously said that our memories and our ability to recall specific details of events are actually really fallible and prone to influence. Again, your mind is not some steel trap, right? And just as you get older, your memories change over time, right? The numbers change, the details change, and oftentimes it's really subtle. You just don't even notice it. But this is a good illustration of how memories change with age. Because when you're young, you're really impressionable and you'll believe just about anything because you have very little concept of how the world works. You just know what you see on TV or in movies or what you play on video games, things like that. So subsequently, when you're young, your mind forms memories of very specific events, usually things that directly make an impact on you or that you directly interact with. So that's why I distinctly remember those things like sitting at the helm of the submarine, right? Using the steering wheels. I remember hearing the dive alarm and so on and so forth, right? I remember picking up and trying to hold the piece of steel that the submarine is made out of, right? It's tangible. I directly interacted with it. So to go back a little bit to what I said in episode 2 where I talked about education, well, especially today, education for kids and teenagers is moving away from lecturing and more towards creating an experiential learning environment. Again, this is basically as far as, at least as far as my experience as a teacher goes, right? We're generally discouraged from just lecturing a whole lot because you remember more of what you do than of what you hear, right? You only remember a fraction of percentage of the things that you actually hear when people just talk at you. And it's only as people get older that they have a longer attention span. They have better understanding of the details, the technical things. So they appreciate details. They have better memories. They can detect social nuances, things like that. Thus, as a general observation, the adults on the tours gain more from them than the children do. And I've had many people come and visit the submarine nowadays, and they mention, much like me, how, oh yeah, I took a tour when I was like really little or when I was a kid, and I don't really remember any of it. So, but now that they're adults, they have a better appreciation of what the tour guide is talking about. So I'll ask, people, has anyone ever taken the tour before? And, usually, a couple of people or maybe a bunch of people raise their hands and they'll probably say like, oh yeah, when I was like, 5 or something, 5 or 6 years old, but I don't remember anything of it. So again, even when I was a kid and I must have been around like 10 years old, even I don't remember much of it. Yeah, I mean, I'm not alone in that respect, right? Now, despite me being back to OMSI many times throughout my teenage years and even into adulthood, because I've acted as a chaperone for groups of like public high school students on like a field trip or whatever, I've actually never been back aboard the submarine. I just never got around to it, despite wanting to take a tour again. Which is kind of odd, isn't it? I've always heard students ask if like, when I take a school group to the museum, like, oh, are we going to go on the submarine? And the answer is always no. I guess school field trips or whatever, maybe like an after school program or some kind of academic program, as far as public schools go anyway, they usually only pay admission for the main exhibit and something like maybe a documentary in the theater or a planetarium show. And I guess it makes sense because all of these things are up in the main building and easily accessible, whereas you actually have to go outside of the building to visit the submarine. Now, we do give group tours, and we've given many tours to school groups that come down to OMSI. But yet, I think every school group that I've seen come through the boat is usually from a private school. Now, I speculate there are a number of reasons for this exclusion of the submarine on school group tours, at least in my experience. Again, this is all experience in public schools. One, I think one of the reasons is that it's an extra price on top of museum admission. And furthermore, the theater and planetarium tickets are just a little bit cheaper than a submarine tour. Again, it only costs $8.50 per person for a submarine tour, but a ticket for like a theater show or a planetarium ticket, they're like $7.50 or $6.50 or something like that. So they actually are a little bit cheaper, And believe me, public schools are not wealthy, at least in the state of Oregon. So yeah, anytime they can find a place to save money on tickets, it's like, oh no, we're not going to spend that extra 50 cents or $1 or whatever to go on a submarine tour now. We'll just get a planetarium ticket or whatever. Secondly, public schools, at least in the state of Oregon, are of a fairly liberal persuasion. Now, I don't really like discussing politics. I'm not trying to get political here, but I'm just saying that there is a tendency for groups with that type of leaning to view anything associated with the military, warfare, and violence as bad. Well, I mean, the last two things, right? Warfare and violence is indeed bad, right? Those are things we generally want to avoid. But the problem is that moral judgments are also applied to inanimate objects, like a warship or a submarine. From my understanding, there was actually some trouble with the museum getting torpedoes, which partially had something to do with, the politics of, the museum and all that, but that's kind of for another episode. So, I mean, we can really get political on this thing if we wanted to, but I'm going to save it for another time. Anyway, long story short is, for whatever reason, be it in a school group or just never really taken the time when I was a teenager or adult, I've never been back on the Blueback for a tour since that one time when I was a kid. But of course, now that I'm a tour guide, I can tour the submarine to my heart's content. And I'm constantly engaged in a learning process to learn more about this submarine, what kind of equipment it has on it, details like that. So hopefully I can expand my knowledge on the submarine and give people a better tour. And as I've said before, and will undoubtedly continue to say throughout this podcast, it's a really fun place to work. I love working on a submarine. I've always wanted to work on a museum ship, and this is great. It's so fun, It's definitely the most interesting educational environment that I've ever had the chance to work in. So, how many people get to say, like, oh, I work on a submarine? Well, I do. It's great. I'm an educator on a submarine. It's fun. Anyway, so that's my long-winded spiel. That's my story of the 2 submarines that I've actually been on in my life, only one of which was operational. So that doesn't make me a qualified submariner. I'm not a bubblehead or anything, but I tend to stay to the surface when it comes to being on the water and, being a sailor. But yeah, that is my experience. Those are my very first submarines, the Atlantis and a tour of Blueback herself. Anyway, that will pretty much do it for this particular episode, so I will see everyone next time.